In this presentation, we share Darwin's experiences in the then young settlement of Albany at King George's Sound and his departure from Australia. The settlement had been established 9 years earlier, but was soon overshadowed by a London-sanctioned settlement at Swan River, now Perth, a little way to the north. By the time of the Beagle's visit, Albany was showing distinct signs of being a somewhat neglected outpost of the Swan River colony. The contrast with Hobart, which had so impressed Darwin, must have been quite marked. One thing to mention here is that the official name is now King George Sound, without the possessive S. We will retain the S in this presentation because that's what it was called in 1836. In telling this story, we are very pleased to acknowledge a book entitled Charles Darwin in Western Australia by Dr. Patrick Armstrong, published by the University of Western Australia Press in 1985. As with the book on Darwin's visit to Hobart, Patrick Armstrong's book provides extensive information about this portion of Darwin's visit to Australia. Here's an 1835 map of the region as it was when the Beagle arrived, showing King George's Sound, Princess Royal Harbour, and the tiny settlement of Albany. After an uneventful voyage along the southern coast of Australia, land near King George's Sound was first sighted at 10 o'clock in the morning of Sunday the 6th of March. From Fitzroy's log, we know that by 5:30 that afternoon, the Beagle had tacked its way up the Sound and had reached the entrance to Princess Royal Harbour. With daylight rapidly failing, Fitzroy decided to drop anchor and wait until first light the next day. As Darwin recorded in his diary, March 6th, in the evening, came to an anchor in the mouth of the inner harbour of King George's Sound. Our passage has been a tolerable one, and what is surprising, we had not a single encounter with a gale of wind. Yet to me, from the long westerly swell, the time has passed with no little misery. At 5:30 the next morning, the Beagle weighed anchor and proceeded through the Narrows into Princess Royal Harbour. 2.5 hours later, all sails were shortened and the anchor was dropped in 3 fathoms of water adjacent to the tiny settlement of Albany. Darwin records in his diary, "We stayed there 8 days, and I do not remember since leaving England having passed a more dull, uninteresting time." Fitzroy's initial reaction was even more unfavourable. In Volume 2 of the narrative, he records, "A few straggling houses, ill-placed in an exposed, cheerless situation, were seen by us as we entered the harbour. And had inclination been our guide instead of duty, I certainly should have felt much disposed to put the helm up and make all sail away from such an uninviting place." Darwin describes Albany in his diary. "The settlement consists from 30 to 40 small whitewashed cottages, which are scattered on the side of a bank and along a white sea beach. There are a few small gardens. With these exceptions, all the land remains in the state of nature, and the town has an uncomfortable appearance." And here's a sketch by Sims Covington, showing the view from the anchored Beagle looking north towards the 30 to 40 small cottages described by Darwin. Continuing with Darwin's diary, "The country viewed from an eminence appears a woody plain, with here and there rounded and partly bare hills of granite." The eminence climbed by Darwin to get the view he describes is most likely either Mount Melville, or Mount Clarence. By far the most encouraging sign in the settlement was the farm belonging to the government resident, the official representative of the governor at Swan River. Darwin's description of his visit to the farm is very brief. At the distance of a mile over the hill, Sir R. Spencer has a small, nice farm, and which is the only cultivated ground in the district. In Volume 2 of the narrative, Fitzroy fills in some of the details of the visit. Behind a hill which separates the harbour from the Sound, a thick wood was discovered, where there were many trees of considerable size, and in the midst of this wood I found Sir Richard Spencer's house, much resembling a small but comfortable farmhouse in England. The hill mentioned by Darwin and Fitzroy is Strawberry Hill. The farm buildings still exist and are a major tourist attraction in Albany. Now in the care of the National Trust of Australia, WA, the property is called Strawberry Hill at Barmup. The Wattle and Daub cottage visited by Darwin and Fitzroy no longer exists. It burnt down in 1870. That cottage was located in the right foreground of this photograph, abutting the two-storey granite house which was constructed later in 1836, just a few months after the Beagles' visit. The single-storey pitched roof building on the left was very new at the time of the Beagles' visit. It was constructed in 1835 as a separate kitchen for the cottage. Decades later, in 1889, the kitchen was joined to the two-storey house by the flatter-roofed alcove. Just as for Hobart, a panorama of King George's Sound had been on display in London, this one in 1834, based on 4 paintings by Lieutenant Robert Dale. As also with the Hobart panorama, the view, this one from the top of Mount Clarence, is distorted, but the individual paintings are very informative. Here's the first, looking northeast from Mount Clarence, showing Strawberry Hill Farm as an isolated cottage in the clearing in the foreground on the far left. Here's the second, showing King George's Sound on the left and Princess Royal Harbour on the right. Here's the third, looking southwest, showing the scattered houses of Albany. And here's the fourth, looking west. Back to Darwin's diary. During the first 2 days after our arrival, there happened to be a large tribe called the White Cockatoo Men, who came from a distance paying the town a visit. Both these men and the King George's Sound men were asked to hold a corroboree or dancing party near one of the residents' houses. And here we have a watercolour illustrating what Darwin describes. It shows a corroboree in the southwest of Western Australia, painted in the 1840s by Richard Atherton Farrington. Darwin continues, as soon as it grew dark, they lighted small fires and commenced their toilet, which consisted in painting themselves in spots and lines with a white colour. As soon as the dance commenced, large fires were kept blazing, round which the women and children were collected as spectators. The Cockatoo and King George's men formed 2 distinct parties and danced generally in answer to each other. The dancing consisted in the whole set running either sideways or in Indian file into an open space, and stamping the ground all together and with great force. These were accompanied each time with a kind of grunt or sigh, or by beating of their clubs and weapons and various gesticulations, such as extending their arms or wriggling their bodies. During the Beagle's stay in King George's Sound, Darwin continued with much geologising. In his diary he records, 8th, one day I accompanied Captain Fitzroy to Bald Head. This is the spot mentioned by so many navigators, where some have imagined they have seen coral and other trees petrified in the position in which they grew. According to our view of the case, the rocks have been formed by the wind heaping up calcareous sand, which by the percolation of rainwater has consolidated and during this process enclosed trees, roots and land shells. In time the wood would decay, and as this took place, lime would be washed into the cylindrical cavities and become hard like stalactites. The weather is now again wearing away these soft rocks, hence the casts of roots and branches stand out in exact imitation of a dead shrubbery. The day was to me very interesting, as I had never before heard of such a case. Here's a closer view of what is now called Flinders Peninsula, showing Bald Head at its eastern tip. The modern term for these petrified trees is rhizoconcretions. As noted by Dr. Armstrong, they are not now as frequent on Flinders Peninsula as they were in Darwin's time. However, they can still be seen near Limestone Point, a bit to the west of Bald Head. As usual, Darwin and Covington collected animal specimens. One of their most important finds was a previously undocumented species of native Australian rodent, the bush rat, shown here in Darwin's Zoology of the Voyage of HMS Beagle. As recorded in the second part of that series, this animal was caught in a trap baited with cheese amongst the bushes at King George's Sound. The bush rat is unusual in that it is not a marsupial, but it is a native of Australia. The species inhabits a narrow coastal strip in the southwestern corner of Western Australia and much of the eastern seaboard of Australia. Another interesting find was a southern frog, which had first been collected at King George Sound almost 2 decades earlier by the French naturalist Coy and Gaimard. Its present distribution is confined to the southwestern corner of Western Australia. Ten species of fish from King George's Sound were included in the Zoology of the Beagle. 2 turned out to be species not previously documented. Here's one of them, the jack mackerel. There were also lots of shells collected, some barnacles, and 66 insect species, 48 of which had not been previously documented. Among the insects collected was a gall-forming wasp, different to the one collected in Hobart. A flower-dwelling beetle, and a plant hopper. Meanwhile, Fitzroy had, yet again, to estimate the meridian distance between his previous port and his current port. As we can see here, his preferred estimate was 1 hour, 57 minutes and 51.5 seconds, which equals 29.46 degrees of longitude. In contrast, the modern estimate from Google Maps is 29.45 degrees of longitude. Again, very close. Having spent 5 days in King George's Sound, the Beagle was ready to depart. Once again, however, the weather proved to be unfavourable. As we can see from Fitzroy's Meteorological Journal, on the 10th of March it was cloudy and squally with wind blowing at force 6 and 7. On the 11th, things had calmed down considerably, but as Sir Richard Spencer recorded in his journal, there were showers all day. On the 12th, the wind was back up to force 5 with squalls. On the 13th, the wind was even stronger, force 6. Finally, on the 14th, the weather had calmed down sufficiently for the Beagle to be able to depart. As Fitzroy recorded in his Beagle log, at 5:20 a.m. the Beagle weighed and made all sail, running out of the harbour. At 5:40 a.m., just 20 minutes later, ship grounded. How embarrassing. Fortunately, this delay was short-lived. With the aid of a cable and possibly the rising tide, the Beagle was set free by 7 a.m. Hove off, made all sail on starboard tack, and at last she entered the open sea. Back to Darwin's diary. March 14th. Our departure was delayed by strong winds, cloudy weather until this day. Since leaving England, I do not think we have visited any place so very dull and uninteresting as King George's Sound. These comments seem a little at odds with his earlier description of the very interesting visit to Bald Head and with the number and variety of specimens he had collected. Moreover, they are at odds with the fact that the King George's Sound area is located in one of the most distinctive botanical regions in the world, a region noted for the large number of native species, over 5,700, and for the exceptionally high proportion, approximately 80%, that are endemic. However, the last sentence in this passage is not so much Darwin the scientist talking as Darwin the young man, whose thoughts were drifting back to the very exciting and interesting social life he had recently experienced in Hobart. In contrast, the nightlife of Albany in 1836 would have appeared to be very dull and uninteresting to almost any observer. Furthermore, the remoteness and isolation of King George Sound would have reminded Darwin that the Beagle was still really at the other end of the earth. There was still almost half the globe to be traversed before he would be home again. Home to a society in which he would have ready and immediate access to all those aspects of civilization that were so obviously lacking at King George's Sound, and to a lesser extent in Australia as a whole. He could see that Australia certainly had an assured future, but he did not feel in sympathy with the types of people that were needed to enable the young colony to achieve her potential. Consistent with the circumstances just described, Darwin's parting words are, "Farewell, Australia. You are a rising infant and doubtless some day will reign a great princess in the south. But you are too great and ambitious for affection, yet not great enough for respect. I leave your shores without sorrow or regret." In later years, as we shall see in the next presentation, Darwin became quite enamoured with Australia, to the extent that he even contemplated emigrating. But for now, we leave the ship full of homesick heroes to make their long way back to England, via Keeling Islands, Mauritius, Cape Town, St. Helena, Pernambuco in Brazil, and the Azores.